So we're going to cover a whole slew of topics, starting with the big picture, moving into hardware, software, markets. So I'm going to kick this off, though, of course, with the big picture. We've had several Bitcoin epochs or eras, right, in terms of halvings, and each one is dominated by various differences. We went from home mining to industrial scale mining, and now we're in an era of sovereign national state mining. It's arrived. And most notably, we have El Salvador that just announced their volcano bond, and the details around the volcano bond, where they're actually going to be using that to help finance energy infrastructure. We also have heard about Bhutan, the small country, and they have a state organization that is mining. And it's actually expanding its Bitcoin operations, which have been going on since 2020. So I'd like to first direct this question to Adam, and anybody else can jump in after. But how do you see this playing out? What do you think is the main driver for national or for state mining? Is it energy, security, national security, and where do you see sort of this trend going?
I mean, it's a very early stage, so I think it's like early adopters, but I think it is strategically interesting and important in the longer scheme of things, because if you look at what's happened historically with, first physical gold as money, and then so-called black gold, i.e. oil, petroleum, and the countries that had oil reserves and adopted the technology, extracting, refinery, and selling, in some cases went from extremely poor countries with few natural resources and a tough time economically to extremely important and wealthy countries in the world because of their access to resources. And so you could think of Bitcoin as the digital gold, and the new resource being access to scalable, low-cost power. And so it's very interesting to see sovereigns not just get involved in buying Bitcoin, maybe via sovereign wealth funds or directly for national treasuries, like in the case of El Salvador, but taking a strategic interest in expanding their power infrastructure to directly mine Bitcoin. And that's also something with a long kind of history and econometrics you can look at, which is that the wealth of countries is, at a point in time, like a snapshot in time, the wealthier countries have access to more power capacity, more energy, because everything in the world is driven by energy. And that's also been true across hundreds of years. So if you think about it from that point of view, a new monetary system that also, funds and monetizes and incentivizes expansion of power capacity, that's also a positive thing for a country's future economic growth. So very interested to see where El Salvador can do with that. And I think it's, within bounds that they could leapfrog even some major European economies in national wealth within the space of a decade or 15 years on the back of it.
I think you raised some good points. And I think what's interesting, too, is there's the national sovereign official kind of mining capacity, but we're also seeing it expand from anywhere from Africa to Texas in terms of funding infrastructure, public infrastructure, whether that's roads, whether that's the energy system, maybe it's not official, but the public is generally benefiting from it, and power infrastructure is expensive. Nuclear is expensive. Historically, we've underinvested in the grid systems, so we have this third pocket that's different from ratepayers and taxpayers. That's the Bitcoin mining network that can support it. Do any of the other panelists have any additional comments?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Max. This is very good questions. For me, firstly, I think this trend shows the increasing recognition of digital assets such as Bitcoin in the national perspective. And that's a very good signal, because that shows that more and more people, more and more nations believe in Bitcoin and think Bitcoin will play an important role in the daily life or social life. And Bitcoin mining of digital assets is not only a game by a small group. Another reason I think of this trend is very important. Bitcoin mining industry is totally different from other Web3 industries such as NFT or DeFi. Bitcoin mining itself is infrastructure. That's very important. From a national perspective, to start mining, firstly, you need to do the electricity construction, promote the local grid, or even to build some new power plants. Otherwise, you won't get a very stable power supply. And second, you need to hire some engineers and workers to do the data center construction or some road construction. That means new jobs for workers, for the blue collars and other local people. That's very beneficial. And also, the Bitcoins they mined will play an important role in their local economy and make them keep in advance in the international currency market. As for the Volcano project and also the Bhutan fund you mentioned, in fact, I just talked with Tether several days ago because they participated in the Volcano project. And they're devoted to clean energy mining, and we definitely will support it too. As for the Bhutan fund, they are also our very long-term and important customer. What I want to say is, Bitmain is the world's leading mining machine manufacturer. We own more than 80% of the market. That means our miners are running in every data center on the earth. That's very important. We have a lot of experience on it. So we will help all the nations, organizations, and other private companies to enter into industry from 0 to 1, and we will help you grow up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to hop over to the halving.
Okay.
You know, it's not here yet, but we're about a year away. So with the halving upon us, do you see risks to the security budget? And what if we scale too much on L1, L2 layers? What are your thoughts on that?
That hasn't been the case in the past few halvings. And the halving has been accounted into the price eventually, before the halving even came. So I don't see this as any substantial risk. And in terms of scaling L2, L3, it's not that much related to actual mining. You need certain security budget for that to happen. But I guess we're already there. So even if there are any slight variations in the hash rate around the halving, should some businesses go out of business, I don't see this as an issue.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think people look at the sort of drop in new coins mined around the halving as the kind of economic driver of mining. And, you know, in some previous halvings, there's been some discussion and apprehension about this kind of wild theory about mining death spiral that would, you know, push the price down and push the hash rate down and decrease the experience, make transactions slower and push the price down. But in practice, you know, that's never happened, and the halvings have been completely smooth. And one way to think about why that might be is, of course, everybody knows it's coming, anybody in the mining sector. And the other thing is that historically, like if you look at the actual Bitcoin price history over the last decade, Bitcoin has doubled in price on average, of course with lots of volatility across years, but doubled on average every year. So, you know, if the price is going up 16 times in a 4-year period and the supply is dropping in half, you know, you've still got an 8 times increase in security budget for Bitcoin, right? And so, you know, even with a bit of volatility in the short term, it hasn't presented a problem. Plus, it's a very adaptive system, right? So, you know, the hash rate has absorbed huge temporary changes, even as recently as last year with the sort of so-called mining ban in China. The hash rate dropped significantly and came back within, you know, 6 months with the equipment being relocated, and Bitcoin was unaffected. You know, some miners made more money from that, some made less, and Bitcoin kept producing blocks and was unaffected.
So given the incredible resilience and adaptivity after the China ban, our industry shifted geographically, particularly North America amassed a significant chunk of hash rate. And there's no other industry that ever faced like a 50% cut and up and moved to other geographic locations, which is pretty incredible. Given some of the recent unfavorable policies in North America, whether that was Biden's proposed energy tax or individual states like New York and Canadian provinces moving against mining, as just general jurisdictional risk with having a huge amount of hash rate in North America, how do you guys see the mining industry changing with the future ahead and this more kind of centralized approach, whether that's to do on the topic of decentralization or pools, geography, maybe even censorship? I'll kick that off first to you, Adam, and then Jan.
Yeah, I mean, Blockstream is mining in Canada and in the US, and a bit of geographic diversity is good, but of course, that's just one company. There are hundreds of companies doing mining at different scales in many geographies. So, as you've seen from the evolution of the China story, that Bitcoin is extremely resilient, and I think another way to look at it is that it's actually anti-fragile in the sense that if some kind of hypothetically extremely dire political pushback on mining in major geographies happened, what would happen realistically is the hash rate would drop, it would get extremely profitable for people who are still mining, and that enormous profitability increase would drive expansion elsewhere. So, it's not really possible to directly impact Bitcoin, because the more you impact the hash rate, the more strong the economic incentive is until you can make a ridiculous amount of money mining Bitcoin, and people will mine it in all kinds of unusual places, in residential, in retail parks, in factories, or in a grey market, or internationally, or on all different kinds of power sources. So it's really an adaptive system that automatically gets stronger if it suffers adversity, because it becomes the more adverse it is, the more profitable it becomes.
I would not repeat what Adam tried to explain, but maybe a tiny detail about North America, where we see this pressure and push towards the regulation. We still shouldn't forget that Latin America, South America, and it's not very well known, but for example, Paraguay has paid back for the Itaipu Dam recently to Brazil. So this country is currently in possession of a lot of excess hydropower that drives the miners around the globe to South America. And that's actually, as Adam explained, miners are extremely efficient in finding the cheapest places on Earth with electricity, and the incentives are extremely strong and high, especially in cases if there was such a huge change, let's say ban of mining in the US, there would be a temporary drop in Bitcoin hash rate, but that means that the remaining part, because we don't have all the hash rate centralized in the US, for example, they would be making a tremendous amount of money, making really strong incentive for the remaining parties to find a good place on Earth to run their operation. So I'm not worried about this.
Awesome. So let's follow that thread a little bit, but dive into the hardware section of the chat. So with mining operations moving to Latin America, to Dubai, and even Africa, how does the current hardware set, does it make sense for those types of environments? Are there any gaps, or what innovation in mining are you guys excited about that are more fit for these diverse climates? Xmei.
Okay, thanks, Max. Considering that all anti-miners are running in almost every data centers on the Earth, so I think I'm the best person to answer this question. For the Middle East and the Latin area, considering the high temperature or high humidity, it's not a perfect place for some air cooling miners, such as our S19J or S19J Pro. In fact, in that areas, most of our customers are choosing our hydro cooling miners, which is our S19 Hydro, S19 XP Hydro. It's our new technology. That means our miners is totally connected to our end space, our hydro cooling container. So with this hydro cooling container, all the miners will be operated in high CO and high adaptability, which means low failure rate and more stable and superhuman being friendly and also environmental friendly. Because the hydro cooling technology means the miners will be operated in nearly zero noise. And that means you even can operate the hydro cooling miner near school and some communities. For me, hydro cooling technology is the technology we believe will be thrive in the next 10 years. Also, there are a lot of other technologies in the market, for example, like immersion cooling technologies. Immersion cooling technology is also a very popular technology right now. But for me, I prefer our hydro cooling technology because technically, water has a higher heat capacity, which means water has a higher heat dissipation. So water is better. And also, for immersion cooling technologies, you need to put your miners into oil. That means it has a risk of some, hurt to some very small components. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a small thing
Go
to
for
add.
it.
We're trying our best on the firmware side, as we're the provider of aftermarket firmware for Bitmain machines. And that we try to reflect all these requirements from the customers where they want to run the machines in various climate conditions. And one of the killing features that they really like is being able to cruise the power target of the machine on the fly. So essentially, when the machine starts overheating, it's going to scale down the performance a little bit. When the night comes in a Texas desert, it's going to scale it up back to the normal level, and so on. So there's like a lot of space for improvement, but still, I believe the hardware itself is quite agnostic of the era where it really is, but you need the software side to really support running it in various conditions.
I was going to go somewhere else, but I'm going to follow that a little bit more.
All right.
So are you on team overclock or team underclock? So it's like the efficiency versus the hash rate.
What gets in the game is your electricity price and overall operational cost when you normalize it to kilowatt hour price.
Yeah.
And then you could be at some point on the overclock team and at some point on the underclock team. But we as Brains, we are not a mining operator. We really run the pool and provide the shovels for the miners, but we don't really mine in large scale. So I guess maybe Adam could speak up to this. If they do the overclock. I would assume they do a lot of overclocking because they want more Bitcoin. They don't care for the efficiency.
What team are you on?
Well, I mean, it depends on the profitability. So in the early stages of a new generation of machine, which is a bit more efficient, and people will be buying those in a positive market, and then they want to overclock to the max because they want to make as many Bitcoin as they can, while they're not cost sensitive, right? But in a bear market, where the hash rate is falling and some older generation machines are reaching end of life, you can extend their life and keep mining at some profit by underclocking. So some manufacturers historically have ignored the underclocking, and so you've got something that would have been profitable, but you can't underclock it either because of the firmware or because of the hardware. So I think the ability to have open access to the hardware, so you can reprogram it, run alternative operating systems and drivers, which is what Jan was talking about there, and a service that Brains provides is quite important because people are operating in different conditions or they want to automate things. So if it's too locked down, that becomes inconvenient.
I think pulling on that, I think it's been amazing that, I know the bear market isn't amazing, but it has been amazing for this renaissance of home mining where just the average individual can pick up a miner and typically underclocking it because, it's really loud and heating their homes. And we're seeing incredible creations of how to channel the heat into folks' homes. But you made me think of something, not your firmware, not your miner. What role does open source play in miner software? That's for Adam and Jan.
I think Adam already touched on this a little bit. There was a shift in the industry from, let's say, 2018, when, let's say, the flagship of the mining was N-9, where the machine was shipped as it is, and I would say you're the actual owner of the machine because you had full control over it. At that time, there was still like data sheets and all the information available. So you could, if you're skilled enough, you could build out your own firmware, which is what we did with BrainsOS. And you could flash whatever firmware you like to into the machine, matching your use case, your needs. But recently, most of the manufacturers, including our colleagues here, changed the policy, which I would be really open to discuss why, not even here, whatever, that you buy the machine, you have access to the web interface, so you can run the machine, you can configure it to your liking, but you still cannot get like full access into the machine. You cannot easily change the firmware without, for example, us helping you with our firmware installation procedures and so on. So from the outside perspective, if you don't have these other companies like us spending their time on how to do this, you're in a situation where I would say you not fully own the machine. And when we go back to the fundamentals that Bitcoin mining is not here just to make the profit, it's primarily to make the profit, but it's securing the blockchain. It's a critical component to have like fully transparent approach to the mining machine and be able to audit it, to understand what it's really doing, to prevent any future security breaches or anything like this. So I would be open to discuss this later on, like why this shift happened. But that's all I have to say to it. So we're trying to sort of like fight it in a way that we're providing an alternative to the stock configuration, to the stock firmware, but still we have to go through the hassle of how to get into the machine and how to install it, which is not as easy as it used to be 5 years ago. And I don't think it can be easily hidden by a simple claim, this is a security issue, because that's more like confusing safety for security. This Bitcoin miner is a security critical device, but it's not a safety critical device. It's not your braking system in your car where flashing the firmware from some third-party company probably is not a good idea because you want to stop the car. But the worst thing that can happen with a machine that's after warranty, that's another topic, is it's not going to mine or you're going to break it, but it's your choice as the owner of the machine. So yeah, and this is something that we can discuss within the industry, like what can we do about this?
Yeah, I mean, we're actually in the starting in the mining manufacturing business, and you know, other companies are too. There are new entries these days, and you know, Blockstream is quite interested in open source, so we're fully interested to run open source firmware and maybe run BrainsOS even, but like certainly to make it easy for people to customize the firmware. Yeah.
So jumping back to hardware, our industry is no different. In terms of offshore manufacturing, right? There tends to be a bit of centralization in terms of manufacturing in China. Just wondering, what are some of the associated risks, or is there pressure that you're seeing to manufacture the hardware in the US?
Well, I think, the main risk with, there are different parts of the machines. The foundries that are at advanced process are mostly not in China, so they will be in Taiwan, Samsung, TSMC, and those are international companies, so they also have foundries in Mexico, in the US, in Germany, all over the place. So that's the foundries, but there are only like 3 or 4 foundries that exist, and it's extremely expensive to build a new foundry. So that's one form of centralization, but apart from that, today most of the mining manufacturing process, like the assembly of boards and so on, is happening in China with outsourced to assembly companies mostly. And so I think the concern is really just that the Chinese government at times has banned different aspects of Bitcoin, and it varies over time, but it is a bit of a risk if the whole industry globally is exposed to Chinese export control, because if they decide that they want to ban mining exports, now all the international miners will have a problem, and if technically you're not supposed to mine in China either, that would also be a problem. So I think it's interesting to diversify the supply chain and the assembly so that it's a bit more global.
And on that particular train of thought, the Western world really has lost its connection to in-house cutting-edge chip manufacturing, with Intel, being the exception. So, what are your thoughts on that in the context of mining?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that some countries have not really paid attention to, but the COVID supply chain issues created some weird anomalies, like people unable to sell new cars because they couldn't get foundry access to make, not even advanced process chips. You can make chips for automotive on 2 or 3 generations old, no problem. But that showed the whole world's industrial manufacturing process is exposed to semiconductor access. And so it's driven a bit more thought at country level policy to having in-country foundries. And so, partnering with TSMC and Samsung and so on, there are now foundries being under construction in, I think, Arizona and other places internationally. So I think that's good. And China is also gradually working their way up towards the advanced process. So there'll be eventually some leading edge foundries there too, I think. So, having more global supply of semiconductors is important in a digital world.
No? Okay. We're going to switch topics now a little bit to the ever-popular energy and environment. So increasingly, of course, we are seeing mining companies turning to clean, green energy. And we're seeing now, kind of for the first time, where we have this decoupling of emissions from hash rate because they're going green, getting into mining on landfills where you're converting CH4 to CO2, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas. What do you think about this trend, and what does Bitmain do, for example, for clean energy mining?
Yeah, clean energy mining is a topic, I very like it. For me, I think clean energy mining is the future of our industry. It's because that our industry is mainly relying on the energy consumption. And in fact, we have already suffered a lot of criticism on this topic, the energy consumption. So for our long-term development, like for the mining in the next 10 years, next 20 years, or next 100 years, turning to clean energy mining is a necessary choice. In fact, Bitmain has to do a lot of work on clean energy mining. We have a center to do the research and development on clean energy mining. And also, we are continue to develop more advanced hardwares with higher efficiency and much more energy saving. And also, we have already cooperated with a lot of our customers to work on the clean energy mining, to do more practices and to help the industry. For example, we have a customer, you guys must be very familiar, the TeraWulf. They built the first nuclear-powered mining data center in USA, and that data center are fully equipped with our S19 XP and our S19 J Pro. And also we have another customer called Crusoe, also based in USA. They're working on a very interesting thing. They are trying to utilize the wasted gas from the oil wells, to use this energy to do the clean energy mining and to reduce the pollution. And also we have another customers based in the Latam area, I think in Paraguay. Yeah, they called Penguin. They're working on the clean energy mining, use the hydro energy from the local areas, yes. And they do have a lot of help on the local energy and electricity constructions. So what I want to say is that turning to clean energy mining is a necessary choice we must to do right now and also necessary in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. No, I think this industry is pretty incredible because we have this digital footprint, but we also straddle, the physical world where we need energy,
Yes.
and we're a pioneering species where we're first to find the cheapest power, and increasingly that is in the renewable area. But we're also, I kind of look at it as Darwin's finches, where we're expanding into every niche possible, whether that's waste, whether it's flare gas mining on waste, or mining landfills or tires like PRTI, or, we're integrating into traditional industries like agriculture and biomass mining on poop, animal poop. And I think that makes us actually more resilient because, sure, you can ban mining like industrial scale, but can you ban home heating? It's just my heater going, right? And so I think there's a resilience there. And I'm just kind of wondering, where do you guys see sort of this integration, like how much of that integration into society, into the energy system, do you guys see, or is the industrial scale mining kind of where we're going?
Well, I mean, I think that access to power capacity drives the wealth of the world, basically, over a long period, and that's certainly been the case for the last 100 years, and there's no reason to suppose that would stop in the future, current policies notwithstanding. So I think the the advantage is that mining has is if you build a new power plant, then you have to find buyers for it, and it's expensive to build a large power plant, and so it will take a long time to repay the investment, or conversely, it will be hard to persuade investors to finance the power, right? So you do get sometimes power owned by state corporations. That happens in Canada, and then they're not particularly economically motivated. Like, they don't mind losing money by the billions per year because they're the government. But anybody from a private sector who's trying to finance infrastructure has to make a business case. And Bitcoin is the ideal consumer because it will use, it can be operated anywhere, and it can use as much unused power as you have until such time as the normal power use builds up around it. So I think it's an ideal sort of co-generation situation to fund and finance an expansion in power capacity. And of course, that's typically going to be zero emission because it's cheaper, There's no fuel to be refined and transported and extracted and so forth.
That third pocket, the Bitcoin mining subsidy, instead of,
Yep.
financing infrastructure is expensive and politically expensive.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that people tend to view power as a scarce resource, but actually there's an enormous amount of unused and wasted power in the world. I think, probably in excess of 30% of power just goes unused. And particularly, Blockstream operates in the Montreal region of Canada, and the local government, things became political some years ago, and they wanted to pause the expansion of use of power for mining, and yet they have, literally enough unused power, hydropower, in that province of Canada to power the entire Bitcoin network today. So I'm talking about pre-built, ready-to-use, unused power. So effectively, they're pouring billions of dollars, across the overflow valves of 65 hydro dams for no logical economic reason, right? And so, that's not the wealthiest province in Canada, and maybe policies like this are part of the reason for that. But it shows that, there's not a shortage of power. Sometimes politics gets in the way. And there's lots of wasted power in the world. So, wasted power can be turned into economic prosperity and employment for regions. So I think Bitcoin is a good economic force to kind of drive sensible policy ultimately.
Yeah. Shortage of political understanding, perhaps. Energy is a complex topic. Go for it.
I have a bit controversial opinion. That is, as of now, humanity, let's put aside the batteries. I don't like batteries. I'm a petrolhead, sorry for that. But humanity doesn't have a scalable mean of storing energy or power. The best that we can do, that seems to scale a little bit, is if you have a hydropower plant, you can eventually pump the water up the hill and then use it later on. There are actually power plants built around this principle with a certain inefficiency that you can see a lot of heat being generated by the pumps. But with Bitcoin, you can actually use it to store the energy. And this is the controversial thing, because you can say, okay, I am able to mine Bitcoin at some oil field where I have a lot of flare gas that cannot be transferred anywhere else because of proximity to grid. So I can burn that flare gas, generate electricity. I'm not able to sell the electricity because of not having grid, but I can mine Bitcoin there, so burn the electricity, store the energy into Bitcoin, and then use the Bitcoin on the other end of the planet, buy the electricity, and build something with it. So that's kind of like, electricity these days is fully commoditized, right? It's not that we have 5 power plants in the Czech Republic and that all the electricity is coming from them. It's like the grids are connected and it's all about the energy market. And this is basically an extension to it where you're commoditizing this and saying, I can use Bitcoin to store the energy and then buy the energy somewhere else and do something else with it.
Bitcoin is a battery.
I like it. I like the concept.
Awesome. So the previous panel talked about Stratum V2. What do individual participants see as the main advantage of Stratum V2?
Okay. I think Pavlenex did a very good intro for the protocol. When we were thinking about the new mining protocol, we decided we don't want to do it like out of the blue. We actually had a problem to solve, and that was when we were developing the firmware, we wanted to collect a little bit of the hash rate as the form of a fee for providing the firmware, and we wanted to have a secure channel between the firmware and our pool endpoint to collect this hash rate. It's about 2.5%. So for that, we looked at the present mining protocol, and when we saw in what state it was, basically insecure, completely plain text. So you can basically, if you want, you can steal a little bit of the hash rate if you inject a small virus into your local network on the router. Being very inefficient, being like fully text-based, that's for historical reasons. It was quite simple to develop applications around the protocol. So we tried addressing all these aspects, and then once we had the concepts, we were like, hold on, like we were not going to keep this for ourselves, and we decided to publish it as a standard, and we called it Stratum V2, even though the original Stratum mining protocol didn't have the V1 attributes to it. So this is how it all started. So I see as the main benefit the security aspect. Finally, the endpoint between the mining farm and the mining pool, if they decide to use the protocol, is secured to the level you can think of it as if you're connecting to your banking application through the website. So HTTPS, TLS, there is some certificate in your computer that verifies that the bank server is the real server and not some scammer server. So that has been addressed. We switched the protocol to fully binary format, so making it more efficient, less data being transferred. That becomes very useful in that use case that I just described. In the oil fields where they mine with the flare gas, they typically run on some tiny SIM card. Their bandwidth is very limited, so they want to aggregate the hash rate. And still, even with the aggregation through proxy, they want to use some efficient protocol that wastes as little data as possible. Or on the other side, they want to get as frequent updates of mining jobs as possible. And third aspect was related to what Pavlenex described. Like nowadays, pools. So us as a pool provide, we do the transaction selection, even though we leave it up to the responsibility of the Bitcoin mining node. So it's not like really our software doing it, but it's the code that is basically generally shared. But theoretically, we could be the evil guys selecting the transactions to our liking. So the protocol comes up with an alternative where the miner basically proposes a template, a Bitcoin block template, with transactions that they choose to their liking. The pool approves it, but the miner can mine on this block template in the meantime. So that's sort of as a security measure for the evil players. But the way I try to think about this, it's not as a security measure if the pool became evil, because you can always switch to a different pool. but I would see it as a future preparation in case we have regulations that step in the game, and we see the regulations are getting tighter and tighter, where if you operate the pool as a legal entity within certain jurisdiction, it could theoretically become impossible to propose the block templates, because the transaction selection would be something that, like, the government would simply say, we don't like the transaction that you select. So it's sort of a security measure, getting ready for the future if any regulations step in. That is how I see it.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's good for decentralization. So there are a few initiatives on this direction, actually. So starting from the direction of decentralizing the selection of transactions to go into blocks. So as Jan said, historically that's been the pools that do it, unless you solo mine, but it's difficult to solo mine these days unless you have a lot of hash rate. And so with this, so there were a couple of other initiatives that all kind of got merged and coalesced into the Stratum V2 initiative on the efficiency side and also on this transaction selection side. So Blockstream was involved in one called OpenHash a few years ago, and then that got rewritten as BetterHash, and now which Square Crypto was involved in, and now that's all merged together. So Square Crypto has some developers, open source developers working on the Stratum V2, and Brains is also, the kind of lead architect on that protocol as well. So I think the big advantage is that there are only really space for 20 or 30 mining pools, because to operate a mining pool, you're providing a service of reducing the variance, like making it more predictable, how many coins you will mine per day or month. And there are a lot more miners than that. So, if miners are choosing the transactions, you get a lot more decentralization of that choice, and so it's much less likely or plausible that policy could interfere with which transactions are processed.
Awesome. We are out of time, but we have a great set of questions. And I'm just going to throw this one out here because I'm sorry, Adam, it's the most popular, and I just have to ask, who's Satoshi?
I don't think I don't think anybody knows, and I think we're never, probably at this point, we're never going to find out. But more importantly, I think that's a good thing for Bitcoin as perception as digital commodity, discovery rather than invention, and a sort of fabric of society rather than a startup with a leader or this kind of thing. So I think it's all positive that Satoshi stepped away, whenever that was, many years ago.
It sprinkles that magic into magic internet money, I think. Jan,
I have totally the same opinion. I'm happy I don't know who Satoshi is.
No, different question.
Go ahead.
Is Brains working on their own miner, hash boards, or chips? Is this a rumor or is this true?
Say it again.
Is Brains working on their own miner or their own hash board or their own chips? Rumors, truth?
I can say that we have released a control board coming to the market at the end of June, shipping in July, I think. We're working on a PSU. We've been designing hash boards with third-party chips. And ultimately, it's probably nothing to hide. We as a company providing the shovels for the miners from the pool going through the firmware, it's a logical extension of our business line, and we would like to enter the market. So that's something that we're working on.
Thank you. Okay. Bitmain has an incredibly high market share. How do we see this developing going forward? Will it increase, or is competition increasing?
I think we will continue to increase because we really have high technology, advantages compared to other competitors. And we have a lot of investment on our R&D development, and I think we are the best since the past, right now, and also in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. So Keio from Nairobi asks, we have some underutilized hydro systems in Africa, over 600 megawatts. what are the key considerations that large-scale miners need to make before moving operations there?
I think that's a good question. So maybe this asker, they can go to our booth. We're in the booth number 5, so we can talk later, okay? About that question. Okay. Yeah.
Adam?
I mean, I guess cooling is going to be a consideration because in a warm climate, you can actually cool more than you would expect with air cooling if you really put a lot of fans and proper air filtration. But still, in a really hot climate, water cooling or immersion cooling is perhaps a safer bet. Of course, it's more expensive, but that's the trade-off, right? That you can extend the lifetime of the equipment, you can overclock more, and you can operate reliably 24/7 in hotter climates.
Taproot has created controversy, especially how it's affected Bitcoin's block space demand. What is the miner industry's take on this growing cultural divide? Well,
like if you look at it this way, Bitcoin is an open permissionless network, and that's the way obviously we all like it because it makes it censorship resistant. Now, technically, the fees for a transaction are proportional to the size of the transaction in kilobytes. But if you think about it, what it will ultimately translate into is that people who are least sensitive about price, i.e. who are willing to pay more, will tend to use up the block space. And so, the rest is up to the market and the economy. So, as Bitcoin enthusiasts, we like the censorship resistance, we like the uncensorable transactions, the ability to cold store your own UTXOs as a saving. And so, our kind of imputed value judgment is that it would be great if as many people as possible can benefit from that. But, just because we think that's a good thing doesn't mean the market will do that, right? And so the phenomena that you're referring to it's not really Taproot because there were inscription-like things dating back years using SegWit or even before SegWit. So it's just an encoding option. But ultimately, if people who are relatively wealthy on a global sense enjoy putting GIFs and JPEGs into the blockchain that displace 100 UTXOs, that's what they're going to do until they get bored of doing it or until they get priced out of doing it or somebody else is priced out. So I think what you have seen is a small windfall for miners. There's a graph you can look at called the hash price, which is the amount of money you get for a terahash a day or something like that, right? And it spiked because of the JPEGs and so on, a windfall for miners. But also that, Bitcoin is a reactive system, and there are other layers. So we saw some very rapid adoption of layer 1.5 and layer 2 things. So people rebalancing lightning channels using liquid Bitcoin, for example. So that piece of technology was developed in the space of a week or two of feverish work because the high fees were making it difficult for that company, which is Bolt's exchange, to rebalance on-chain because the fees were too high. So I think high fees create inconvenience, which causes people to innovate on a layer 2. So, indirectly, the JPEGs cause some more innovation. That's good.
We talked about nation state adoption, and Bitcoin mining is infrastructure. What's China's current stats on mining? Because I know some hash rate kind of shifted back. Xmei?
So you asked the official policy in China?
Official and maybe unofficial, if you can talk about it.
The official policy is the whole mining industry is basically illegal in China right now. Yeah, that's the official policy. But as far as some, small mining data centers, some small size, who knows? Yeah.
Jan, is Brains considering developing heating-oriented feature for Brains OS? I know there's a lot of home miners that use your software.
I would be happy to hear the spec for such a feature. Maybe one thing to point here is that the mining machine is sort of like a racing engine, and it has to run at a certain temperature, and it's a common misunderstanding as the cooler the better. there is a certain point where you're getting optimum results. If you go under, the chips don't perform. So if there is, like, as of now, what we provide as a feature is that you can cruise control the power drawn by the machine. So you set your target at 3 kilowatts. If you don't like it, you can go down, and that kind of reflects if you're using the miner to heat your heating circuit in the house or for whatever heat extraction technology you have. Then we have these features. If there is any other requirement, like what should BrainSOS support in order to support the heating, we're open to suggestions.
Okay. We'll take that under consideration.
Sounds good.
Adam, in 2022, there were a few articles mentioning Blockstream exploring the use of a Tesla Megapack storage with mining. Is this option being still explored? Is it viable?
Yeah, so, I mean, it falls in the same topic of a previous discussion, which is that Bitcoin mining as sort of a source of demand to buy power can help finance power infrastructure. So we thought we would, build a small-scale project and prove that effect, and then try to scale it from there. So yeah, it's still in development.
Okay. I look forward to hearing on that. This is quite a popular question, Xmei. Will Bitmain support Stratum V2 explicitly in their firmware? Yes or no? Can you talk about it if yes or no?
It depends on what firmwares. For example, I think in the last December, we provided some underclock firmwares to some customers. Yeah, because it can save the energy and help you to pass that difficult time. The Bitcoin price just decreased a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
For overclock, we really don't suggest from the perspective of the manufacturer, because it will truly hurt miners. So we don't suggest that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Adam, what's your take on the recent soft war discussion?
Soft war?
Soft war,
Oh,
Jason
right,
Lowry.
yeah. Well, I think it's interesting to see people, for people who've been involved in Bitcoin for a while, you feel like you understand it all, but I think actually in practice our society's understanding of Bitcoin and what it means ultimately is still evolving for everybody. And so Michael Saylor has made some interesting comments that of course even people who've been involved for a decade to think about some parts of it in a different way. And I think for example, he has one about Bitcoin being a portal from the digital world to the physical world, which is true in the sense that, Bitcoin is ultimately secured and scarce because the protocol is able to verify something that's happening, which is very industrial and physical. So that's a unique thing in the digital world. But, Lowry with software is making some other interesting observations, about sort of cyber defense and, warfare and the history of it and the sort of economics of it, that life itself is a form of resource struggle, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a logical amount to spend on defense, and that, maybe digital property registers would be a more efficient way to secure property rights in the digital realm. So I think it's interesting, and he makes the analogy that, physical warfare is sort of migrating towards drone warfare, like unattended or even AI-driven equipment. And at that point, it's almost a logical game, right? So he's saying, well, you take the drones, you remove the propellers, and you put them in racks, and now you have the ultimate conclusion, which is you have a hash rate war in data centers instead of drones destroying each other.
From my perspective, I think from a more defensive rather than offensive position, if you are boosting your energy security through financing energy infrastructure, if you're creating resilience in your grid, if you're boosting food security, for example, recycling the heat into farming implementations, in a way, you're winning as a country. So I think there's for me, a point to be made there. Xmei, what new miner is in development? How far can we go below 5 nanometer process?
Pardon?
How far can we go below the 5 nanometer chips? Like, any secrets on what's going on in development? Are we going to lower nanometer chips?
Chips?
Sorry, not chips. I have been traveling for 36 hours. In terms of developments in mining.
So, like 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer, is 3 nanometer coming next?
So I mean the long roadmap, maybe?
Like advanced process, so going from 5 nanometer to 3 nanometer. So does Bitmain have plans for a 3 nanometer miner?
3 miners?
3 nanometer, yeah.
Don't too long.
Well, I think in any case, like Bitcoin is catching up with the bleeding edge of foundries. Yeah. So you can see, maybe Intel and Apple and ARM and memory manufacturers. I mean, there are foundries, we know that much, building on 3 nanometer, probably not like at mass production level, but within a time frame, right? So you can certainly look at that. And these days, Bitcoin is using the bleeding edge. And if you use a foundry, you can sometimes get access to early stage ASICs if you accept the risk.
Okay. Thank you, Adam.
Okay. Honestly, what excites you about mining? Like, we're here in the mining space, but there's got to be like something that gives you like, I want to get up today. What is it?
I would say the power to secure the. I feel like we're contributing to an ecosystem that secures something unmatched in the humanity. Like, this is the first time the humanity has a digital asset that's immutable. Speaking of the records in the blockchain that are virtually impossible to modify because of all the work that has been exercised to mine the blocks, and which is thanks to the concept that Adam invented back in the day. But this is what I find exciting, like this combination of all the technologies in one place, and at the same time we're not playing with a computer game as a toy, but it's a computer game with strong economical incentives. It's about money, but at the same time it's about creating a balance towards the current financial system. And I'm assuming a lot of people notice these news that somebody turned on inflation, but it's not somebody turned on the inflation. They have been printing money for past couple of years, and now we see the outcome. And the system that we're trying to contribute to is the exact opposite. It's deflationary. Then we can have the argument with the economical scientists, like what's the truth. But I feel this is what I find exciting. And like specifying or focusing on the mining part, I think what I like about it is that this is ultimately the component that's securing all the cryptography behind Bitcoin. Because the mining itself is not about cryptography really too much.
Bitcoin is founded on this elegant system of economic incentives, and it's got that heartbeat that ticks every 10 minutes, and I think that's pretty special. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this panel.
Thank you, Max.
And thank you, panelists, for your thoughts.